Look at the Strait of Hormuz from above, and the geographic vulnerability is obvious. At its narrowest point, the water separating Iran and Oman is just 21 miles wide. It is a natural bottleneck, barely large enough to accommodate the massive commercial tankers passing through it every day. Roughly 20% of all seaborne crude oil and liquefied natural gas squeezes through this single passage. On February 28th, a U.S.-Israeli decapitation strike against Iranian leadership triggered immediate retaliation. Missile strikes abruptly severed these resource lines, creating a war zone. By March 4th, Iran effectively blockaded the strait. Qatar Energy, a primary global exporter of liquefied natural gas, was forced to declare force majeure because its ships physically could not leave the Gulf. Hundreds of cargo vessels were suddenly trapped. Economists immediately drew parallels to the energy crises of the 1970s. Global markets began pricing in acute supply shortages, currency volatility, and the very real threat of prolonged economic stagflation. Cutting off a fifth of the world's energy supply overnight creates an immediate mathematical problem for the rest of the planet. A localized military conflict triggered what the International Energy Agency labeled the greatest global energy security challenge in history. The first damage hit the Gulf states themselves. Within days of the blockade, the combined oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates dropped by at least 10 million barrels per day. But the region relies on the strait for imports as well. Gulf states import roughly 80% of their food through this route. With cargo blocked, retailers were forced to airlift staple foods, driving consumer prices up by over 100%. The crisis rapidly shifted from economic to humanitarian when Iranian forces struck local desalination plants. Kuwait and Qatar rely entirely on these coastal facilities to generate 99% of their drinking water. Facing water scarcity and a sudden grocery crisis, hundreds of thousands of expatriates and skilled foreign workers fled the region, hollowing out the local labor force. The financial contagion spread outward. Brent crude oil surged past $120 per barrel, triggering crippling price spikes at consumer gas pumps across the United States and Europe. Nations that had spent decades building reputations as highly wealthy, stable economic hubs were suddenly rationing food and water, struggling to keep their populations alive. The second shockwave spread through the sky. As military strikes crossed the region, multiple Gulf states entirely closed their airspaces to civilian aircraft. Major carriers like Emirates and Qatar Airways suspended operations, abandoning their fleets on the tarmac. This erased the primary transit corridors connecting Europe to Asia, forcing the cancellation of over 4,000 daily flights. Europe was caught particularly exposed. Following a harsh winter, European gas storage sat at just 30%. When Qatari LNG shipments stopped, Dutch gas benchmarks doubled in days, forcing the European Central Bank to immediately halt planned interest rate cuts. In the Asia-Pacific, nations dependent on imported fuel hit a wall. By late March, the Philippines was forced to declare a state of national energy emergency as its domestic oil supplies simply ran out. The global transportation grid physically seized up. Logistics planners realized that modern supply chains cannot easily bypass the Middle East. The system requires this specific corridor to function. Beyond oil and gas, the Gulf holds a significant global share of raw materials necessary for modern civilization to function, and those materials transit the exact same blockade. The region produces and exports roughly 45% of the world's traded sulfur, along with massive amounts of urea. This chart shows the direct relationship between those materials and global food security. Urea and sulfur are the baseline ingredients for commercial fertilizer. When the strait closed, nitrogen fertilizer prices doubled, threatening spring planting yields and driving long-term spikes in grocery prices. At the exact same time, the shutdown of Qatar's gas liquefaction plants choked off roughly 35% of the world's helium supply. Liquid helium is essential to cool superconducting magnets in aerospace engineering and to prevent unwanted chemical reactions when manufacturing semiconductors. Without it, the global tech and manufacturing sectors were strangled. A military conflict over oil immediately dictated the availability of wheat in Brazil and silicon chips in Taiwan. The physical materials required for farming and computing share the exact same choke point. Even with a ceasefire negotiated, the structural damage to the global economy remains. The long-held assumption that the Gulf is an insulated, futuristic safe haven for global capital is dead. In Europe, chemical and steel manufacturers face prolonged energy surcharges of up to 30%. Without access to cheap imported gas, many industrial sectors are moving toward permanent closures. Globally, central banks are trapped. The sudden scarcity of fuel and raw materials has driven inflation back up, limiting their ability to cut rates and risking a prolonged period of global stagflation. Shipping companies are actively rerouting massive commercial vessels around the Cape of Good Hope. Cargo is traveling thousands of extra miles to avoid the region entirely, adding baseline costs to every shipped good. The 2026 war laid bare a severe vulnerability in modern trade. We built a highly optimized, interconnected global economy and then routed its survival through a single 21-mile wide stretch of water.